Greetings, YouTube. As you all might know, that in my previous video, which was an old video that I somewhat edited, I addressed Barbarossaaa and others in the Manosphere who are opposed to conspiracy quote-unquote theories. This is in no way an attack on Barbarossaaa, and I still give him credit for all the knowledge he has provided on topics pertaining to female nature, female behavior, feminism, the male mother need, and etc. etc. Except for topics pertaining to conspiracy quote-unquote theories and conspiracy quote-unquote theorists. Nevertheless, I do want to further respond to Barbarossaa's position on conspiracy quote-unquote theorists and those like him in the Manosphere. However, before I continue, I want to show Barbarossaaa and other conspiracy deniers in the Manosphere the following clip from Sean Hannity's Fox News program. Enjoy.
There is a big thing that's going to happen in London at this G20, and then they're hiding it, they're camouflaging it, they're not talking about it. Coordination of international regulation. What they are going to do is to put our Fed and our SEC under the control, in effect, of the IMF.
Oh, come on.
They're
You
going
believe
to
they'll
take,
do this?
that's what was in the draft agenda. They call it coordination of regulation. What it really is putting the American economy under international regulation.
Yeah.
And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
Conspiracy theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
Yeah, well, when Geithner,
It's happening.
When Geithner said he would be open to the idea of a global currency last week,
Yeah.
those conspiracy people had said and suggested that for years.
right.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong.
And you know, it's what they always do at these conferences is they have the center show is here, and the side show they don't want you to pay attention to.
Right.
The center show is the size of the stimulus packages. The real show is international regulation of the financial institutions, which is going to happen under the IMF control. And remember, the IMF is run by Europeans, the World Bank by Americans.
DickMorris.com. Thanks, Dick. Appreciate it.
Hopefully after watching this Fox News clip, Barbarossa and those of his likes would be more careful in calling people like us conspiratards. Anyways, moving on. In my last video I quoted from David Rockefeller's memoirs where I show how he confesses his agenda of establishing a one-world political and economic system from the same picture you are now seeing in my video. Now it is true that the underlined red parts in the image you are seeing are in the section of Rockefeller's book called in the section of Rockefeller's memoirs called Populist Paranoia. But before Barbarossa and others in the Manosphere jump on their conspiracy denier bandwagon, one also needs to note that though David Rockefeller is speaking in a sarcastic tone, when saying what you see in the underlined red parts, if you go to the previous chapter, to this chapter, you see Rockefeller has titled it Creating a Global Bank. So read the title of this chapter and now read the last parts of the underlined red area. And I quote, "To build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it," unquote. Now compare the last part of the underlined words that I've just read with the title of the previous chapter to this chapter where I read these underlined in red words from just now, the last parts of them, that is. With the title of the previous chapter, which I mentioned earlier, is, and I quote, "Creating a Global Bank," unquote. and I'm going to further expand from there. Before I continue further discussing David Rockefeller's confession of forming a one-world political and economic structure, I want to explain to you all what you are seeing in this video of mine right now. These words are the words of a fellow conspiracy truther, Sterling Munz, and he is writing in response to a conspiracy quote-unquote debunker who commented on an Amazon customer review of another fellow conspiracy truther who was writing a customer review of David Rockefeller's memoirs. Even though David Rockefeller calls people who accuse him of being behind the agenda forming a one-world political and economic system as paranoid, and makes his confession in a tone of sarcasm, still does not prove the case of conspiracy deniers on this topic. Again, I say, even though David Rockefeller calls people who accuse him of being behind the agenda of forming a one-world political and economic system as paranoid, and makes his confession of doing all these things in a tone of sarcasm, still does not prove the case of conspiracy deniers on this topic in any way. Sterling explains how, and I quote, "What is powerful about someone like Rockefeller is that he can use his intelligence to appear to be sarcastic on making such a statement. And I agree with your assertion that he was addressing those people as being paranoid, and this is the role of counterintelligence. You speak a truth in sarcasm as if it were not true, never denying and in fact admitting it, all the while with tongue and cheek. And in the Rockefeller's case, there is a mountain of evidence of his guilt. And let's forget about the Bilderberg Group for now. I dare you to prove me wrong. I tried to prove some friends of mine absolutely wrong, and the deeper I dug without a personal agenda, the more evidence, which is so clear, so blatant, that it defies the imagination. And let's just say that his Rockefeller Foundation has a very dark side that it has been used for since its inception. And if I were planning to take over the world, I would have very much done what he and his family have done: control all education, media, and resources through a small group of like-minded elitists." Unquote. As you all can see, Sterling provides a very good alternate explanation to David Rockefeller's sarcastic tone of his one-world agenda, confession, and accusations of those who accuse him of such things to be paranoid. Sterling beautifully summarizes all this as being an example of counterintelligence. Evidence that further backs the likelihood of all of this being an example of counterintelligence as compared to anything else is the fact that just a chapter before his One World Agenda confession is titled "Creating a Global Bank." So on one hand, he is sarcastically speaking of making a one world structure that is political and economic in nature, and just a chapter before, the same man titles it "Creating a Global Bank." Now let me just repeat that again. So on one hand, he is sarcastically speaking of making a one world structure that is political and economic in nature, and just a chapter before, the same man titles it "Creating a Global Bank." Clever man. Mind you, the global bank he is talking about is not the IMF, nor is it the World Bank, since both of them were founded in the 1940s. And Rockefeller's memoirs was published in 2002. Creating a global bank would further centralize the powers of central bankers, as if they need any more power than they already have. The following clip shows the level of power that central bankers hold even now.
So mostly what they do is hold summits.
I think that right now the question is, do we all work for central bankers? That's what I want to address to our guest tonight. Is this global governance at last? Is it one world, the central bankers in charge? Jim Urio, you say we've got some downside here, a correction in the markets. Fine. But aren't we all just living and dying for what the central banks do? Aren't we all just counting on the fact that there's a Bernanke put and that we won't go any lower than, say, 5% down from here?
Of course we are, because if we look at the economic data, there's nothing to get excited about in that. So yesterday we saw some reluctance for the Bernanke Fed to expand their balance sheets and pump more money in. But the stock market knows that reluctance is totally different than not willing to do it at all. And that's why we saw oil implode and gold trade off heavily, because they're not a protected class. If the stock market starts trading off in the 10 to 15 to 20% area, the chairman's going to come in and throw some stimulus at it. So to answer your question, we are absolutely slaves to central banks, because we'd love to be slaves of the economy, but the economic numbers continue to do nothing but trend lower.
Mr. LeCamp, do we work for the central bankers?
We know that.
Mr. LeCamp,
we do. This is free. We do. Look, markets are driven by policy now. They're not driven by market forces. They're driven by fiscal cliffs. They're driven by central bank proclamations. They're driven by false rumors coming out of the ECB.
Fiat currency that's continually watered down. They continue to water our currency down so the markets go up and we feel good about it.
Yeah, and listen to what the Fed did this weekend. I think they really screwed up here. They said that we're going to do this Operation Twist through the end of the year. In other words, they're going to create uncertainty about what happens after Operation Twist, right at the same time that the fiscal cliff kicks in. Do we really want all that uncertainty?
Jim, but we have to give the Fed a break here, because the Fed realizes that what they're doing is probably going to have very little economic effect. The only real thing that can help is fiscal and policy changes. So the Fed, all they have is rocks and stones left. They're just going to throw them. They know that they're probably not going to do any good as well.
Gentlemen, Jim and Jim.
Isn't that...
So much could be said on this subject. But now, I want to end this video by sharing Dr. Carroll Quigley's words from his book, Tragedy and Hope. A History of Our World in Our Time, that was published in 1966, decades and decades before Rockefeller wrote his memoirs talking about creating a global bank, and decades before the CNBC clip I showed you guys earlier. Here are the words of Dr. Carol Quigley, and I quote, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups." Unquote.